Good afternoon, and it's wonderful to see so many faculty and students and scholars gathered here this afternoon. And I'm delighted to welcome each one of you to our inaugural Middle Eastern Week for the first time ever. Middle East Week is supported by One World Boston, an affiliate of the Cummings Foundation, to encourage discussion on democracy and peace. And I know that this series will be filled with insight on such timely topics, and I recognize that how could it be anything but insightful and stimulating under the leadership of our Ryan professor, Dr. Lenore Martin. And I'm happy to ask Dr. Lenore Martin to welcome our speakers and give appropriate introductions to our speaker today. We're so honored that you are all here. Lenore? I'd like to thank Sister Janet for hosting Middle East Week. And here at Emmanuel, as you say, it's our first one. And I'd also especially like to thank One World Boston, a Cummings Foundation affiliate, for the funding to make this exciting program possible. Thanks to them, we have been able to bring Dr. Sadik Al-Azm and Dr. Ron Pundak here, and they are two prominent scholars and political activists who will be here for a week of learning and engagement with our students, with our faculty, and as well as the colleges of the Fenway. This program is especially timely, as Sister Janet mentioned, because of the enormous political changes in the Middle East, a region of religious, cultural, and economic importance to the United States and to the world. I might also add that today's program is a great way for me to announce our newly approved Middle East minor here at Emmanuel. And I want to take just a minute to thank Kathy Redmond, Dr. Susan Van Dam-Thal, and Dr. Arlen Sanchez-Silva for helping. This is our Middle East Committee, and worked for 2 years, really, to get this minor through, so I wanted to give them special thanks. Now to an honor which I've been waiting for months, the introduction of my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sadik Al-Azm. I hope you'll forgive me if this introduction is a bit longer than usual, because for the past 50 years, through his books, articles, pamphlets, and political activism, Dr. Al-Azm has participated in the major social, political, religious, and ideological debates in the Arab world. I will therefore use a few of the major highlights of his extraordinary career to introduce him and some of those debates to you. Professor Al-Azm was born in Damascus, Syria. He received his BA from the American University of Beirut and a PhD in modern European philosophy at Yale University. His contributions to the field of European philosophy, Islamic studies, and Middle Eastern history, politics, and culture has brought him invitations to teach and lecture at some of the most respected institutions all over the world, and here today at Emmanuel. Dr. Al-Azm has won renown for introducing the practice of critique into Arab social and political thought. And he really moved that thought from its traditional literary mode and emotional style to systematic argumentation, respect for facts and evidence, and rationally considered action. This became evident in his work on the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian problem. He was the first Arab intellectual to publish a long essay entitled "Towards a Better Understanding of the Zionist Idea." That was a very courageous act, especially at that time. He was also the first to start a joint Arab-Israeli journal, Hamsin, which first appeared in Paris in French. More than a great academic and teacher, Dr. Al-Azm used his scholarly work to criticize authoritarianism in the Middle East. And this we saw following the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. This led to a short imprisonment, his statements on that fact, a short imprisonment in Damascus and a long show trial that echoed throughout the Arab world. Again, courageously, in 1992, Dr. Al-Azm was the first scholar in the Arab and Muslim worlds to publicly criticize the fatwa, by that I mean legal ruling, of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah had authorized the killing of Salman Rushdie at that time because the Ayatollah believed Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verse, was blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad. Sadik wrote a book on the subject, Taking on the Ayatollah. He received 500 pages worth of responses, and he answered those responses in another book. There are many who wonder at the fact that Dr. Al-Azm actually survived that period of time. It's important to note that his work on this and all his other challenges to unjust authoritarianism were published in Arabic. Thereby, he not only stimulated the wrath of political leaders, but more importantly, that was the brave and courageous side, but more importantly, he inspired change at the popular level. This has been evident in the last 2 decades when Dr. Al-Azm was active in trying to build civil society during the short Damascus spring of 2000 to 2002 that followed the coming to power of the new president, Bashar al-Assad. Dr. Al-Azm was an initiator in drafting Chapter 99, also known as the Statement of the 99 Intellectuals of the Statement of the 99 Intellectuals. The Charter called for the end of martial law, the release of political prisoners, and the promotion of civil society and civil rights. One has to wonder if we would be here today in Syria had the new president heard Dr. Al-Azm and the 98 other Arab intellectuals. Dr. Al-Azm was equally instrumental in the drafting of the Beirut-Damascus Declaration of 2006, signed by Syrian and Lebanese intellectuals, which called for the declaration of full Lebanese statehood. This was heresy at that time, as Syria never recognized an independent Lebanon and saw it as part of Greater Syria. Many intellectuals who signed that declaration, were questioned and arrested. In response, Dr. Al-Azm became a founding member and president of the Syrian Human Rights Organization that advocated for the release of these prisoners, and he did this in coordination with Middle East Watch, Amnesty International, and PEN International. The Syrian regime retaliated by subjecting him to interrogations and denying him an exit visa. So that effectively prevented him from leaving Syria. It meant, of course, he would not be able to come back home. When he did leave Damascus in 2010, he was not allowed home, though he was allowed to live in Beirut. In the same vein, Dr. Al-Azm was one of the earliest supporters of the Syrian uprising, especially in its non-violent period. His piece in Arab Spring, Why Exactly at This Time, was written in Arabic in the summer of 2011. It was translated into English and circulated widely. He spoke out publicly, appearing on some of the most popular Arabic TV and radio broadcasts. When pro-Assad gangs targeted Syria's critics in Lebanon, Dr. Al-Azm was forced to leave Beirut and found sanctuary in Bonn, where he was a 2011-2012 fellow at the Kate Hamburger College of the University of Bonn. He is currently a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study of Berlin and a member of the National Coalition of Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces. That is the internationally recognized political opposition to President Bashar al-Assad. He is a founding member of the League of Free Syrian Writers, and along with his wife, Iman, is working to help, who's sitting right here, I might add, is working to help Syrian refugees during this tragic period. For many years, Professor Al-Azm's scholarly work and political activism has inspired the minds of many Arab students and changed the direction of their lives. I happen to know some of those people myself. Clearly, his efforts has had a great impact when we look at the young men and women challenging autocratic governments around the Arab world, putting their lives in danger, calling for civil liberty programs, and civil society programs that include such values as respect for human rights, freedom, civil liberties, and an independent judiciary. It is therefore with great respect and anticipation that I turn the floor to Dr. Sadik Al-Azm.
No, you were so generous, you leave me speechless. Still, I thank all of you for being here this afternoon. And my big gratitude goes to Emmanuel College for making possible such an event as a Middle East Week in the Boston area. Also for privileging me and honoring me with the invitation and the wonderful hospitality with which we have been treated. Of course, my greatest appreciation goes to Professor Leonor Martin for her heroic efforts, determination, and persistence to make all this happen and overcome all kinds of obstacles and hindrances, not least of which was the snowstorm. Now, she promised to provide better weather next time. Through this discussion of the Arab civil society question, I hope to be able to shed some light on the nature of the upheavals that have suddenly hit a number of key Arab countries after a long period of stagnation and decay, and shed light also on the recent historical background and social context of what has come to be known as the Arab Spring. The commotion over civil society and civil government heated up and asserted its immediacy and relevance in the mid-70s of the last century, particularly in Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, with important contributions coming from North African thinkers and intellectuals. The most famous instance being the debate and exchange of letters between two very prominent Arab thinkers and public intellectuals, one in Morocco and the other one in Egypt, on the topic of secularism in the Arab world. Now, since the term secularism in Arabic got associated with atheism and anti-clericalism, the term civil gained dominance as a euphemism for secularism, for a secular form of government, and for a mild kind of separation of state, power politics, and law on the one hand, and from Islam as a faith and religion on the other. In the middle of the 70s, particularly after the October War of 1973, between Israel on one side and Egypt and Syria on the other, it became evident that the earlier Arab politico-cultural consensus of nationalism, populism, and Arab socialism, put together and presided over by President Nasser of Egypt in those days, that this consensus had broken down catastrophically and dissipated. Naturally, various forms of Islam, Islamism, and jihadism rushed in to fill the resulting political and cultural vacuum. At the time, it seemed that the only acting agents in key Arab societies, particularly Egypt and Syria, were the military regimes with their martial law and state of siege condition on the one side, and armed insurrectionary Islam with its demand for the immediate application of Sharia law, and Sharia law is really the martial law of the Islamists, and their powerful slogan at the time, Islam is the solution, on the other. It was at this critical conjuncture that the concepts and practices of civil society and civil government imposed themselves as the only practical way out of that destructive deadlock. This is the occasion on which the Arab concerns and discourses on civil society and civil government intensified and felt to be most urgent and pressing matter for avoiding worst-case scenarios. The working definition of civil society then took the form of two negatives: a society of equal citizens run and managed neither by martial law authorities nor by Sharia law Islamists like Iran. The working definition of civil government said at the time, a government that is positively neutral vis-à-vis the religious sects, confessions, and ethnicities that make up the people of countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, for example. In the continuing Arab concerns over these issues, the concept of civil society is not only a descriptive category, but has for us, and especially at present, a critical content and a political cutting edge. This is why John Locke, Hegel, Karl Marx, and Antonio Gramsci figure so prominently in these discussions and are quoted and re-quoted as focal reference points for validation and persuasion. By the mid-80s of the last century, I can say that a new quasi-consensus had emerged concerning the way out of the impasse that had been reached between the oppression of the militaristic state on the one hand and the random violence of the Islamist and jihadist opposition on the other. This quasi-consensus embraced the notion of civil society plus a number of allied values and practices usually attendant on the idea of civil society, such as the primacy of citizenship, some respect for human rights, something of an independent judiciary, and a more attentive attitude to things like civil rights and civil liberties. This new consensus flowered for the first time politically and in practice in the short-lived Damascus Spring of 2000-2002, and in the important documents the Damascus Springs produced and propagated, and in the civil society movement that the Damascus Spring sparked, and in its Charter 99, referred to by Professor Martin, named after the famous civic initiative in communist Czechoslovakia known as Charter 77, all of which formed kind of a prelude and a dress rehearsal for the later outburst of the Arab Spring, its aspirations, values, demands, and slogans. A fundamental distinction drawn by the civil society movement is between civil society on top and Ahli society below. Ahli society is characterized by the primacy of primordial relations and forms of social organization such as kinship, blood ties, clan, tribe, village, ethnicity, religious sect, and so on, each with its own asabiyya. The concept of asabiyya comes from the famous Ibn Khaldun and is usually translated as group solidarity. But the term solidarity in English is too weak really for our purposes here, as it fails to communicate the powerful charge of fanaticism and intransigence that needs to be added to the English solidarity before approximating the Arabic asabiyya. Historically, Arab civil societies emerged slowly out of Ahli society and tend to float on top of Ahli society. The main agency for this emergence has been the modern colonial and post-colonial state, with modern legislation and law acting as effective forces of socio-economic change and modernization. As is well noted, in civil society, the primordial kind of ties tend to erode and get diluted in favor of more utilitarian approaches and forms of social interaction. I mention all this because the Muslim Brothers and other Islamists in the Arab world willfully obfuscate this distinction by speaking and acting as if civil society is all society, especially in places like Egypt and Syria, thus intentionally absorbing back whatever civil society now exists into the deep sea of Ahli society below. For Ahli society is the political province proper of Islamism and Islamists, and this is where their popular constituencies and sources of strength really reside. This is why they speak loudly and accept firmly democracy as majority rule, but fall completely silent on democracy as minority rights. In this sense, the phrase, the return of Islam, may be seen as Ahli society lashing back at this thing in the making that we call Arab civil society and its novelties, lashing back via organizations and instruments like the Muslim Brothers, Jama'ah, as they call themselves, and its sisters and offshoots. For the Arab martial law regimes, the very mention of the word civil is anathema. as the first association that comes to the mind of an Arab when the word civil is mentioned. The word civil is Madani, just like in English it comes from Medina, the city. The first thing when you mention civil that comes to the mind of an Arab is not military. These regimes, the military regimes, have intentionally worked on fragmenting whatever civil society we may have achieved in countries like Iraq and Syria, fragmented along the lines of the primordial divisions of Ahli society, and by energizing the latent asabiyas of these divisions, all in order to render any kind of popular organized opposition unthinkable. This is why the Damascus Spring and its civil society movement were so swiftly and brutally crushed. In the end, both military rule and Islamic Sharia law, or Islamic Sharia law rule, use, abuse, and instrumentalize Ahli society for their own purposes and interests, and they do it always at the expense of emerging civil society and in ways detrimental to civil society. Let me add here that thinking of Arab society in terms of the way out of the impasse of the martial law state pitted against the Sharia law violent opposition, and as a mediating, autonomous, and relatively neutral sphere between Ahli society and its fissures and asabiyas on the one hand, and the militaristic state on the other, is akin to the way European theoreticians and philosophers accounted once upon a time for civil society as a sphere of human activity, interaction, and relations, which is neither the province of the traditional private household nor the province of the modern state with its increasing public function. Hegel identified this new sphere with bourgeois society tout court, while Durkheim understood it in terms of a new division of labor between the public sphere of the state per se and the private sphere of the household as such, regarding the whole new arrangement as distinctive of modern Europe alone. Antonio Gramsci would have thought that a vibrant civil society is the best protection and guarantee against a grab of power by the more regressive elements and forces in a society. In current Western discussions of civil society, the emphasis is on NGOs, voluntary associations, churches, mosques, clubs, charities, self-help groups, professional associations, trade unions, various interest groups, and so on, all as the decisive constituents of the meaning of civil society. For example, in his work on civil society in the Middle East, Professor Richard A. Norton, who is here tonight, this evening, of Boston University, gives the following definition of civil society, and I quote, "Civil society is the melange of autonomous associations, guilds, unions, interest groups, clubs, social institutions, and political parties, which provide a buffer between the individual and the power of the state." End of quote. This definition, from our point of view, is too static and too mature for giving an accurate account of the civil societies that are still in the making in the Arab world. Many of the elements mentioned in Norton's definition tend to be more a part of Arab Ahli society rather than civil society proper. Furthermore, Norton's definition overlooks completely the critical content in our use of the concept of civil society and blunts its political cutting edge. Basing himself on this kind of conception of civil society, this kind of mature conception of civil society, the Dartmouth University anthropologist Daley Library goes very far in his enthusiasm for proving against Western skeptics like Ernest Gellner that civil society does really exist in Middle Eastern countries. Eichelman goes so far as to affirm that under the Buyid dynasty of 10th and 11th century Iraq and Iran, a vibrant civil society existed and functioned. For Eichelman also, civil society is equivalent to the presence of institutions autonomous from the state, which maintain orderly economic and political relations, depending on forms of informal association, and so on. Now, carrying the concept of civil society as we understand it and promote it now, all the way back to 10th and 11th century Iraq and Iran, is a grave abuse of the term that renders the idea of civil society totally useless for present-day Arab purposes. The grand divisions of classical Islamic society were free versus slave, Muslim versus non-Muslim, man versus woman, and plebeian versus patrician. Does it make sense to speak of civil society under the reign of such ancient divisions and classifications? Again, if 10th and 11th century society in Iraq and Iran is to be seriously described as civil society, then what is so hot and so novel about this thing we call civil society in the Arab world today? Why all the commotion? Why all the sound and fury? We may as well have stayed where we were in the 10th century as Arabs and Iranians. And the silent implication being here that our history is incapable of producing anything genuinely new on this score, and which is not simply the continuation of what once existed in some classical phase of history or period of time. Here, Norton and Eichelman show themselves to be good Salafis in wanting to justify the present by invoking the continuity with the deep past and by calling for support on the presumed longevity of what we have had and what we are today. As an Arab, I understand that in highly atomized Western societies, it would be natural to think of civil society in terms of NGOs, clubs, churches, mosques, voluntary associations of all kinds, as these tend to bring the separate social atoms together and promote a sense of community. But this is not a big problem at all in Arab and Middle Eastern societies, for instance. What is most interesting and crucial for the promotion of civil society in the Arab world is the idea and practice of citizenship, which takes the form of a movement from Sunni Muslim to citizen, from ethnic minority to citizen, from Alawi, Dirzi, Ismaili to citizen. From woman as a awra, that is something shameful to be hidden and covered in Ahli society, to woman as an equal citizen of civil society. All this is absent in Norton's definition of civil society, while it all becomes quite absurd, transporting this baggage back to 10th century Iraqi and Iranian societies a la Eichelman. In other words, it is best to confess from the very start that what we are struggling for, or the struggle for a functioning civil society in the Arab world, is neither a restoration of something that was once there, nor an extension of it, but the instituting of something genuinely new, where, for example, the old merchant classes and bazari types of Ahli society are transformed into something resembling a modern bourgeoisie. For purposes of contrast and comparison, let me note that when the Muslim Brother Organization, or Jama'ah, as they call themselves, was first formed in the late 20s of the last century, they purposely and intentionally anchored themselves in the pre-civil, pre-citizen identities of the Egyptian people. This practice continues to the present moment. Let me note also that towards the end of the Cold War, the bulk of the Arab left, including most communist parties, became the most ardent and eloquent defenders of civil society, its role, and the kind of programs and practices attendant on the idea of civil society. This was not a purely opportunistic move on the part of the big segment of the left, but it was a retreat to the second line of defense against what that left saw as the creeping medievalism of the Islamists, jihadists, and Taliban types on the one hand, and the oppression of the militaristic martial law state that we have lived under on the other. Now I can say that at its prime, the Arab Spring was the finest hour of the various youthful Arab civil societies on hand. From Tunis to Cairo to Sana'a, Yemen, to Benghazi, Libya, to Manama, Bahrain, but not to Damascus. In Damascus, the Tahrir Square experience proved impossible. Above all, the Tahrir Square masses defeated the dynastic principle of Arab presidents passing power to their offsprings and secured in principle the victory of the democratic idea of the electoral circulation of power, all encapsulated in the shout reverberating throughout the Arab world's Tahrir squares, which says, لا تمديد, لا تجديد, لا توريث. Freely translated, it says a big no to the mechanical extension of the president's term of power, and another big no to the automatic renewal of the president's tenure in power, and a still bigger no to the Arab president's irrepressible desire to pass power to their sons and relatives. In other words, down with the Republic of Cousins in the Arab world. In this, various Arab civil societies finally found their voice and are busy asserting it. Conspicuously absent from the Arab Spring and from its Tahrir squares and revolutionary forces were the traditional cries, slogans, demands, and banners of good old Arab nationalism, especially as we have known them during their heyday in the early post-colonial era of the last century and after. So, just as no banner was raised anywhere from Tunis to Cairo to Tripoli to Sana'a and to Homs, Syria, saying Islam is the solution. Similarly, no banner was in sight either saying Arab unity is the solution or Pan-Arabism is the solution. All the Tahrir Square shouts, cries, demands, slogans, and goals were typical civil society values and aspirations. They all centered on freedom, on rights, on dignity, integrity, plurality, democracy, transparency, equality, and so on. I can say here that all this had been very carefully and systematically formulated, raised, and presented in the documents produced by the Damascus Spring and by its civil society movement. Most importantly, the Tahrir Square experiences showed how, for the first time ever, the charisma of the revolutionary moment shifted from the usual Arab concentration on a single and unrivaled leader. The charisma shifted to the flow and diffusion of the assembled masses in these many Arab Tahrir squares, making the congregation the true charismatic moment of the revolution and of change. Indeed, it was a charismatic moment of collective self-assertion and of speaking truth to power, heedless of the risks and dangers attendant on such a move. This important development is new for us Arabs and for our modern social and political history. It is civil society's main contribution to the moment. Thus, the Tahrir squares in Tunis, Cairo, Sana'a, and Benghazi were all characterized by the immense participation of women and the visible presence of children, boys and girls. This in extremely conservative societies and very prudish cities. Add to that the various forms of art, innovative types of expression, music, performances, songs, plays, dances, balloons, prayers, satirical cartoons, sarcastic comments, and critical graffiti. Generally, all of that done with happy faces, despite the wholesale use of aggressive thugs, deadly militias, indiscriminate repression, and live ammunition. Actually, there was a carnivalesque spirit and practice in all these packed squares. I mean carnivalesque in the Bakhtinian sense of carnival, where carnival is a mocking and deflating of the pretensions of high power and oppression, all of which is certainly unheard of in the history of modern Arab political demonstrations and forms of mass political protest. It bears mention here that civility and tolerance were abnormally at their peak in these Tahrir squares. I will cite one example. While Egypt has been known for a while now for Muslim-Christian confessional clashes, killings, church burnings, and such, the Cairo Tahrir Square was the exact opposite. Throughout the 20 days it took to push President Mubarak out of power, during this charismatic moment, you could see Christian priests with their distinctive garb, hats, and crosses, conducting Coptic religious ceremonies, while right next to them an imam leading rows of Muslims in prayer without a trace of tension or interference. Similarly, crowded Cairo is notorious for the harassment of women. Still, it has been noted that no case of sexual harassment was reported and no complaint raised throughout the Tahrir Square experience there. It is interesting as well that the Arab Spring revolutions did not raise the banner of revolutionary legitimacy to justify themselves or resort to revolutionary justice to deal with their enemies, as happened in Iran with the success of the Islamic Revolution there. The Arab Spring revolutions appealed instead to typical civil society concepts such as constitutional legitimacy and to ordinary due process justice to deal with their foes. This is a major break with a history of Arab military coups d'etats that invariably designated themselves as revolutions and that justified their seizure of power by appeal to revolutionary legitimacy and dealt with their enemies in terms of special courts and extrajudicial proceedings. In Syria, the Tahrir Square experience proved impossible because of the ferocity of the military repression. Still, the revolution there is accused of being spontaneous, leaderless, and lacking in strategy. This is so because here again, the charismatic moment of the revolution saw a shift from the old leaderships of organized vanguard parties, inspired single leaders, and unrivaled singular heroic personalities, a shift from those to the youthful local coordinating committees known as the Tansiqiyat. It is these local coordinating committees that lead and energize the street power of the revolution and are responsible for sustaining the on the whole civil nonviolent side of the uprising against military rule, martial law, and the police state that Syria has been for the last half-century. Given the spontaneity of these committees, still they have been able to knit themselves into a national network continually in touch with similar activists both in Syria, the Arab world, as well as the wide world beyond, using with great expertise the most up-to-date electronic forms of communication to further their revolutionary agenda. They have been able as well to frustrate the military regime's efforts to block and suppress the flow of information. They achieved that by sustaining a steady flow of real-time images and vital pieces of information concerning what is actually taking place on the ground all around the country and practically all around the clock. On the military side of the situation in Syria, the fighting local equivalents of the coordinating committees, through their dispersion all over Syria, forced the regime's stormtroops to spread themselves very thin all over the country at the same moment, which led to their scattering and exhaustion, having to shuttle suddenly from Dar'a in the extreme south all the way up to the Turkish border in the north, and then back again to the middle and south of the country. This is why we hear that a rural town like Daraa was invaded, occupied, and then evacuated by these stormtroops at least 20 times during less than 15 months. As for the Free Army of Syria, I would like to remind here that Europe and the United States did a lot of soul searching during the second half of the last century on the question of whether higher orders, especially higher military orders, do absolve those so commanded from responsibility for their actions. The defectors from the Syrian army to form the Free Army of Syria are spontaneously and without too much reflection living up to the norm that higher orders to commit crimes and atrocities do not in any way absolve those so commanded from responsibility for their actions and deeds. They live up to it by refusing superior orders to shoot at and bomb villages like their own villages, folks like their own folks, and city quarters like their own city quarters. This is the ethical meaning both of their defection and of putting their life and the lives of their families and relatives at great risk by refusing to obey higher orders of this kind. We should thank our stars as Syrians that the Syrian army is still a conscription army, a people's army, and not a professional army. These officers and soldiers have my highest respect and deserve the recognition and greater respect of the US and the West in general. Still to be noted here is that in post-revolutionary Egypt and Tunisia, the spirit and charisma of the Tahrir Square experiences are certainly not dead, but continue to struggle against great odds to make a better future for the two countries. In fact, if only 20 to 30% of the spirit and charisma gets routinized, naturalized, and normalized in the ordinary life of these societies, then immense progress would have been undoubtedly achieved. This should be evident from the fact that when newly elected President Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, impatient with the messy due process procedures of a democratic transitional stage towards stability and normalcy, he arrogated to himself absolute powers and absolute immunities, putting himself and his presidency beyond any accountability. Then half of Egypt suddenly erupted in anger and protest against any hint of the possible reproduction of Egypt's traditional despotism and despotic rulers, thus showing in the process that Egypt today is not just Muslim brothers, Salafis, fundamentalists, and religious fanatics, but is also a crystallizing and energetic civil society. This civil society eruption was so intense and pervasive that President Morsi quickly had to withdraw this absolutist degree and rush the other way to make sure his controversial draft of the Constitution passes the plebiscite. In spite of the heavy Islamic rhetoric and Sharia justification, only a fraction of the electorate took part in the plebiscite, and the draft of the Constitution was approved by a rather insignificant margin, while Cairo returned a resounding no to this constitution. And Cairo to Egypt is not like Washington to the United States. In other words, for the first time ever, the ruler of Egypt is denied a mandate to steer the country and run it as he sees fit. Certainly an earth-shaking development in both past and present Arab politics from above and Arab politics from below. Again, I end by saying it was civil society's finest hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lecture. And this first happened, I lived through the debate like this. Dr. Norton is sitting right here. But,
I would like to draw your attention, my hearing is impaired. So I need the assistance of Professor Martin to repeat the question at earshot, so I can, comment on it.
I'll do my best. And actually, I realize in preparing for this, I should have microphones to you all. So you have to pretend you're from Brooklyn, like this professor, and belt it out. Okay, so I'm open to the first question.
Well, the Shia-Sunni break is really a turning back from civil society and a return back to Ahli society, Asabiyas and Ahli society allegiances. And what we are seeing is a big struggle going on between the two. In Syria, some have said that this is a kind of civil war, but it's not really a civil war if we take as our model, which is closest to us, to Syria, the Lebanese civil war of the last century. It started in 1975. In Lebanon, the communities themselves were armed, not the state. Okay? And they were ready to attack each other. In Syria, neither the Druze, nor the Ismailis, nor the Christians are arming themselves to attack each other. It is really the state which is Alawi dominated and highly militarized, okay, which is doing the attacking. This is going to be very bad for future relations, especially between the Sunnis and the Alawis in Syria. Relations are almost irreparable by now. But hopefully they will realize that only a concept of civil society and citizenship would remedy that situation in the longer future. Thank you. That's, I appreciate that too very much from you. This is fine.
Can you hear that?
We are close enough.
Yes, everybody hearing?
Your definition
Well, I think the way they deal with it is when they speak about civil society, they really mean much more Ahli society, because this is where their constituencies are. And deep down, I think they are not very happy with civil society. Now, power, responsibility, the problems, and so on, I think would civil societize them slowly. And I take here the example of Iraq. For example, the Harith al-Dari, who is the chief of the Sunni ulama of Iraq, has been calling for a not just civil government, but has been calling for a secular government out of fear that the Shia will dominate. And recently, Sistani sent a letter to the prime minister there mentioning that he wants a civil government. What makes these two chief leaders, Shia and Sunni, do that? Because they know that if one prevails and imposes its own interpretation of Sharia, then the other will revolt. There is no question. There will be civil war. And I think that in Egypt, with Morsi and the Muslim Brothers, I think slowly raison d'etat would start taking over. and they will get transformed more in the direction of something civil rather than being able to Islamize the state themselves. I think the stakes are not in their favor in this. And you can to some extent see that in Morsi's, wavering and dilly-dallying and not really knowing what to do about this. From our point of view, the point is what to do with the Muslim Brother type of Islamists. Of course, you can have the Qaeda type, that's Taliban type, that's a different story. Is that hopefully not by argument, but by dint of responsibility and having to run the state and so on, they will come around to some kind of a civil society concept and practice. But by the way, apropos of what you said concerning your passage, now, I don't know to attribute everything or all that to you, but I find from both in Europe and here, from contacts and discussions and debates with colleagues, friends, with students, and so on, that there is no understanding of civil society beyond the definition you gave. Okay, I'm sure yours is much more sophisticated. I know this from your books. But the general impression I have of what they mean by civil society doesn't go beyond these few lines that you cited.
We have two more questions. I think some of the ones on the website
That's why I did it.
I didn't quite catch what. Well, yes, especially coming from the Salafis.
Okay, I'm just going to ask everybody at this point.
Just hold on. We're going to end the meeting with very disruptive to my profile. This is what we're going to start. So we're going to do that. So if you just hold on for a few minutes and then we'll go.
Let me say this. If you trace the discourse of the Muslim Brothers, there has been a sea change. For example, some years ago, they produced a document on the reform of state, society, law, and so on. And in it, there is hardly any of the old thing about the Khilafah, the restoration of the Caliphate, about the Quran being our constitution, about the immediate application of Sharia law. And unfortunately, Sharia law becomes the penal code. This is why I called it the martial law of the Islamists. And all this have completely disappeared, and you find paragraphs there that you think you are reading Diderot or Montesquieu in their, and as Professor Norton has pointed out in political practice, for example, imagine that someone like Morsi, compare what he used to say about Hamas and Israel when he was in opposition, and now he became the intermediary between Hamas and Israel once he is in responsibility. And some people think that, there is a deal with the Americans that when he arrogated to himself all these powers, the American government said nothing, didn't criticize that. And it seems that the deal was that in return he would, keep Hamas and the peace in place. Hamas being a branch of the Muslim Brothers originally.
Gotten there, and I was wondering, I can throw one out, but
Well, they certainly have stayed out, but that's true of all the other minorities, and of course Syria has a lot of them, is not special to them. The idea that only a totalitarian system or only despotism can protect a minority is, of course, a big absurdity. And what goes unnoticed is that, now the one that is really being destroyed is the majority. Practically every city, every town, every village, every forest, every farm that has been destroyed, burnt, torn apart, etc., are all Sunni. While the areas of the minorities, whatever they be, tend to remain relatively calm, almost untouched, and have become refuge spots for the displaced Sunni Syrians, the people of Homs and Hama and Rastan and so on. And the way I see it, of course, this is why I say it's not a civil war, because none of these communities have a stake really in attacking each other or turning, and the regime has been able to instill this, being a minoritarian regime, has been able to instill this fear in the minorities that somehow the Sunni majority is just waiting for the moment in order to attack and persecute the minorities of Syria, which again I think is, at least an exaggeration, if not an absurdity. And I expect that when, this thing is over, Assad is gone, and people return to their homes and reconstruction starts, then, first of all, you have the popular, spontaneous religiosity of the people. This is not dangerous. The populars in Syria, the spontaneous popular religiosity of people is quite tolerant and has accepted each other, and there haven't been, since the 20s at least, any problems on that. Then you are going to have, I think, the Syrian bourgeoisie and Syrian capital is going to pour in for the reconstruction, just like to some extent we saw in Lebanon, the reconstruction period. And then I think it will be the good for business Islam that will float to the surface, rather than the Taliban type of Islam.
I think that's such an optimistic answer. I think it's a great way to end, and thank Dr. Al-Azm.